So just, I imagine everybody knows who I am by now, but I'm Veronica Strang. I'm the Executive Director of the IAS, and this is the first of our formal public lecture series for this term. So I thought I would kick off proceedings. And my job really is to tell you a little bit about Anna, and she is a post-medieval and rural archaeologist. She obtained a PhD in historical geography at the University of Genoa with a dissertation on rural archaeology, and she's also the PI of an ERC project called Antigone: Archaeology of Sharing Practices and the Marginalisation of European Mountains. And that began just a couple of months ago at the Laboratory of Environmental Archaeology and History at the University of Genoa. And then from 2021, she's also going to be an associate professor in rural and landscape archaeology in the Department of Antiquity, Philosophy and History at the University of Genoa. She has some previous form with UK funding. She was a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of the Basque Country between 2014 and 2017 with a project called Archimedes, which is about the archaeology of the commons in Southern Europe. And broadly at the same time, she was an associate researcher at the Laboratory of History of the Alps of the University of Italian Switzerland. It sounds like you spend your time in the most gorgeous places. Since September 2019, she's been the Italian representative of at the Committee of Ruralia Association, and she was also recently awarded a Strengthening of Excellence Award from her university. And she's actually been to Durham previously as a co-fund fellow, a senior research fellow in 2018. So it's very lovely to have you back, Anna. Just to say a little bit about her research interests, they're in the history and archaeology of European rural societies, the historical system of environmental resource management, and with a particular reference to practices and commons, and the contribution of the research for a sustainable future for European rural areas. So she's also helped to create a European network of the archaeology of the commons, and that involves scholars from a number of different institutions. Her research focuses on dialogues between disciplines, and her methodological approach to the study of rural societies combines archaeology and archival investigations with the aim of developing an original approach to historical archaeology and stressing the role of historical studies in the future planning of mountain areas. And her works on the archaeology of the commons focus on the jurisdictional dimensions of environmental resource management practices and on topics of ownership, tenure, and access rights. This is such a topic after my own heart. Now, considering the value of practices as possession actions and therefore not restricting the evidence of appropriation to the presence of enclosures. So we have a very nice theme emerging already in this project about processual forms of ownership and the less tangible sorts of things. And her interest is in the potential of archaeology to detect changes in jurisdictional access rights and new practices and lifestyles in relation to environmental resource management and its infrastructures. So her Antigone project hopes to investigate the role played by changes in sharing practices in the marginalisation of European rural societies since the late 18th century. So while she's in Durham, Anna is going to be working with Professor Chris Gerard and his colleagues, and Dr. Henry Jones from the Durham Law School. And this research group has a common theoretical approach, a post-colonial approach, which involves local scales of observation and very high levels of analysis. They're going to study collective land ownership and access rights to common land, such as mountain pastures or woodland. And they want to explore this topic from multiple and complementary perspectives in the distant past as well as in the present day. So they're going to set us case studies on a common set of questions of landscapes of memory, practice, rights, and heritage. So in this way, the research aims to overcome the lack of a multidisciplinary investigation in processes of land appropriation in the past and in the present. Now, Anna's published several research monographs. Her most recent text in 2018 combined archaeological and archival investigations and hopes to develop an original approach to the historical archaeology of rural society. It's also one of the first attempts to focus on the jurisdictional dimension of environmental resource management practices from the perspective of archaeology and to discuss them as ownership, tenure, and access rights. So today, Anna is going to talk to us about, got her lecture title here, Common Lands, Practices, and Local Knowledge, an archaeological perspective to the inner social dimension of landscape ideas. So over to you, Anna, and we all look forward to it.
Good afternoon. I am very happy to have the opportunity to present you and to discuss with you my perspective, my archaeological perspective to what I have named the inner social dimension of the landscape. I will try to show you from where I moved and toward where I am going, and I will do it through a, I hope not so quite long journey in the last 3 centuries, and trying to present not only how practices changes and how local knowledge changed too, but also how changed the way to consider rural areas and also our interpretation of the past. I think there are many strictly correlated dimensions, and we have always take into consideration from where our perspective on what we study derive to understand what we understand in our sources. And well, it's better if I go forward. I will try to introduce this presentation with some, I hope, nice picture that are aimed to show what I mean for the inner social dimension of the landscape, and that mainly is the sense that practices to manage environmental resources, but any practice more wider, are also ways to appropriate, to occupy the space, and so are the materialization of a social relationship, and also of way through which we claim the possession of the place, that could be a possession toward an ownership, but also toward an acknowledgement of the overall. And here we have 2 shepherds who are discussing, because the sheep of one of them entered in the territory of the sheep of the other, and so there is a jurisdictional problem, we could say, about the access right to pastures. And here there are also some archaeologists of my research group in the Basque Country. We are in the Basque Country in the Aizkorri Plateau between Álava and Gipuzkoa. And they are documenting the archaeological evidence and the present organization of this area. And we could say that it is another way to appropriate the space, because we know that archaeology contributes to the process of the heritagization of the cultural heritage. So the way through which archaeologists document the space contribute to the acknowledgement, to the recognition of their values. And so it is quite interesting to see how archaeologists contribute to this process. And this is a very clear sign of possession that is a dangerous of autumn. It is very well spread in Great Britain. It is a well evident sign of possession. When we see a dangerous, we always think that it divides a private plot from a public road or a public space. And so it is quite evident as a sign of possession, as well as is a very clear sign of possession, this private chapel that is at the bottom of a terraced slope. And we could suppose that the owners of the chapel were also the owners of or the slopes, and maybe they managed in that period the slopes, so maybe they terraced it or changed something in those terraces. But there are also some less recognizable, even if well visible sign of possession, like this tree of water that is a seen to testify that the plot in which it is a private plot. It is, well, it is a clear sign if we know it. If not, it is an isolated tree. And here there is less recognizable, even if still visible, sign that is a sign of a temporary appropriation. This is the evidence of what remain of the fence of rosaceae. And these fences, these vegetal fences, were used to close temporary cultivation, and then they were cut to open the spaces to the grazing activity, to the pastures. And so it is interesting to see that there is also a temporality of the occupation. I will come back to this concept later. And all these things, we could understand them if we are able to recognize them, if we have learned how to document them. If not, they remain mute. And so we cannot understand the spatialization of the social relationship. And my starting point is that I am an archaeologist. I am a rural archaeologist at the present. I was a medieval and post-medieval archaeologist. And when I started my PhD in historical geography, I met a new word, and it was a word full of trees. And I found out that I live in the most covered tree region of Italy and maybe of Europe, because the 63% of the surface of Liguria is covered by woodland. And I found out that they are too much. I never thought that too much was something attributed to woodland, but then I have to state that it is right. There are too much woodlands, and they grow up in too close, in too few time. And this is the area about which I will speak about, mainly about 3 case studies in Ligurian Apennines. They are in some close valleys in Ligurian Apennines, and I think it is useful to see where we are with the picture I will show you. And this is Rovegno, and well, all these trees are a touristic attraction, and the nature, the wilderness of the space is surely exploited by local administrators to say to people, come here to live the nature, to relax in this nature. But if we go inside to this nature, we see that it is not so funny as it seems from outside, because we have too much diet tree, and there are woodland that are impossible to enter in because there are too much woodland. And if we go a little bit more in deep, we see that these trees, these diet trees, originate some process of erosion with many environmental consequences. And also that when we have too much trees, wildfires are more dangerous. And so there are many consequences of this present naturalization. And if we see at this nature from an historical perspective, we see that it is the consequence of a process of abandonment of agroforestry pastoral activities that occurred not so much years ago, well, in 1 century, but mainly in the last 40, 50 years. And if we consider abandonment as an historical process, we see also that it is closely related to the policies of naturalization that, at least in Liguria and in Italy, was promoted for mountain areas as the solution for the less productive rural areas, because it was not possible to have a good economic value from mountain areas. And so with the modernization of and the mechanization of agriculture was promoted also the abandonment of the traditional way to manage resources, so of the open areas, of the open pastures and of the non-intensive agriculture. And during this period, we have the increase of woodland and the decrease of population. So it is two inversions, well, two processes that could be considered parallel. But why, until now, abandonment is not considered in its historical perspective, as it is clear if we see the series of documentary sources? Well, I think that, well, not just I, but it is very quite well known that the consideration of the spaces is only focused on the present situation. So we have the map of land uses that only in a seemingly neutral way represent that areas that previously were terraced, chestnut terraces or olive terraces or woodland pasture, wooded meadow pasture. They are represented as a mixed woodland. And so all the past uses disappear, the evidence of past uses disappear, and together with them disappear also the idea that this is an abandoned space. And so if we don't know it, we take not it into consideration. But maybe, well, as I said at the beginning, it could be important to consider it because it is not so far process, because the most part of the abandonment of Ligurian mountains took place in the last 40 years. And it is the problem because it was a too short process. And for this reason, there are many problems of hydrogeological disease and of wildfires, because too much trees grow up in too few years. And it is a quite well-known correlation, and it has been already studied here in the Canton Ticino, the relationship between the increase of anthropic fires, the increase of woodland, and the decrease of husbandry, and so of livestock and farmers. And how? Well, how this the abandonment as an historical process have been considered? Well, here it is to point out the high contribution of the English local history and then its influence in the historical ecology approach as developed by Oliver Rackham and more in general by the historical ecology discussion group. We know that English local history was aimed to consider the landscape not just like a wallpaper, a wall plot where human activity took place, but as a part, as a source of the historical processes, and as to consider the landscape not only a source, but an historical place, and so to reconstruct this history of the landscape, not just of the people that live there. And it is interesting to note that William George Hoskins, that could be considered the father of the English local history, even if it is a more large process that have a long development, also before the Second World War. After writing The Making of the English Landscape, participated to the Royal Commission on Common Lands. And this commission was aimed to make an inventory of commons of the England and Wales commons, because with the aim to map them, to know the extension of the still preserved common lands, and to start to address the problem of the nature conservation related to these spaces, and in correlation with it, to have an idea of the legal problems related to commons. It is very interesting because since the very beginning around commons, the problem related to environment, to nature conservation, the legal aspect were closely related, and as we'll see, they are related because both of them depended to the environmental resources management practices. And this relationship between the environmental dimension and the social dimension is what influenced the historical ecological approach. And in fact, at the end of the 60s, the Historical Ecology Discussion Group at the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology of Monkswood was created to understand semi-natural ecosystems in terms of their past, and then apply this understanding to management for conservation. Well, it is important to point out that in Italy, the importance of the comprehension at the local level of the ecosystems in their context, it is still not used to manage rural areas for the natural conservation. And so it is something that make a big difference between the national perspective on the environment. Well, one of the most studied topic of Oliver Rackham were trees, and he, for the first, point out the importance, highlighted the importance of wooded pastures, as they were the most widespread and maybe, at least in Southern Europe, almost forgotten way to manage trees in European uplands until the end of the 19th century. We have many evidence of past wooded pastures and evidence of past pollarding practices and shredding practices. And it is they were so important, wooded pasture, because in the same plot it was possible to have a multiple production, and so timber or wood, and on the other side the grass. As the trees were not so close, the grass could grow up and allow to, and those spaces were used also as pastures, and not only, and as we will see. And thanks to the acquisition of the historical ecological approach, trees could say their story. And so this stamp, for example, it is an imponent chestnut stamp, could say us that the three main phases of his life, the present abandonment, when nobody take care of him, the period of copicing when the stamp was created, and the ancient wooded pasture to which probably was related, represent of this impotent tree, because the stems are what remained of a previous trunk. And so this is the dimension of a previous tree that was quite big. And historical ecological approach could benefit of the development of environmental archaeological research and the development of the methods of the analysis of the pollen analysis, of the analysis of soils through geoarchaeology, of the study of charcoal, and by the fact that environmental archaeology, day by day, year by year, always tried to reach an analytical level, moving from the perspective to reconstruct ecological dynamics in the long term to the reconstruction of practices to manage environmental resources at the local level. And so this microanalytical analysis allow to develop an approach to study also the management of not permanently inhabited space. And so historical ecology could profit not only by the study of documents and by the archaeological investigation of settlements and by the oral sources, but also from the dendrochronology, the anthracology, and of course of the vegetation cover and the presence of possible indicator species and of the evidence of past practices as pollarding one, but also by all the microanalytical data that pollen, that geoarchaeological and archaeobotanical analysis offers. And so being able to cross different disciplines and different data at the local level. And it allowed from different perspectives, also disciplinary, and in different countries, and which reciprocal influences in some way to reconstruct precise system to manage environmental resources and how practices changed along the times in at the local level, because all the approaches to reconstruct environmental resources are keeping together by the same perspective that is to reconstruct in its context, in its social context, not only how the environment changed, but how it is closely related to a social dimension and to understand practices in their context, not as something that could have a general meaning. And so this is just an example to show the complexity of one of the possible practices, of the practices that was reconstructed. This is a cycle well documented in a part of Eastern Liguria in Aveto Valley. It is a cycle of various years where the same plot were used as wooded pastures, but also as timbered and woodcut and wood collection. And then through some practices related also to the creation of confined fires for temporary cultivation. And after new again as pastures when as pastures and as wooded pastures. And this cycle were realized not only to have multiple uses, but also to answer to a need of the not scientifically aided agriculture, that was the need to reproduce resources, to constantly reproduce resources, and to preserve and to continuously transfer the fertility that could explicate the organization of transhumant movement and of short and long distance transhumant movement, if we see them as the way to transfer fertility from mountain to lowlands or to coastal areas, in the case of Liguria, we see the close correlation between agriculture and husbandry. And it is important to say also that practices, as well known by local people, but also by institutions, has also a juridical meaning, a jurisdictional meaning, because they were the way through which the possession of a space, mainly in common lands, that was mainly in common lands, was testified through the use and the transcription testified by witness of their uses. And so this coincidence between facts, practical facts, agricultural practices and juridical facts is very interesting and played a key role in the dialogue of the possession between local actors and institutions, and the importance of the jurisdictional dimension of the agroforestry pastoral practices is well testified by one of the many conflicts around boundaries. But by many, I take just one example that is from conflicts between Repubblica of Genoa and Granducato di Parma around the Selva della Penna in the Ligurian and Tosco-Emilian Apennines. And the problem was that it was not possible to trace, to identify the right boundaries, the line of the boundary. And one of the key elements through which the use and so the possession of the space was testified by the different local people were temporary cultivation in archival documentation Ronchi. And temporary cultivation, in fact, were one of the main topics to testify possession, and even if temporary. And the close correlation between jurisdictional dimension and technical dimension, between the double meaning of action as a way to produce product, and also with the jurisdictional meaning, and the close relationship between common lands and legal question is well testified, as I said, by the book of Oskis and Dudley Stamp. They focus on the legal question arose from various processes of appropriation of the space and by some process of enclosures. And it is well testified also by the many problems during that are well known about rights of way. This is an example from an interesting controversy around the Clarendon Park at the beginning of the 20th century. And this relationship and the materialization of access right is also well testified by other things that we could still see in the landscape. This is a wall, a particular wall named Cresta, that was used to separate mule tracks from private plot because it was used to avoid that transhumant sheep entered inside private plots when they were not allowed to do it, because in some period of the year they could enter there. And so there are many evidence and many possibilities to understand how practices and jurisdictional dimension are closely related. And this was the background with which, well, this was the background I built when I making my investigation, about which I will speak about. And I studied a place that is Perlezzi that did not respect the general trend of Ligurian Apennine. It was not abandoned. The vegetable garden were still in use and still in use are. The terraces were still in use and are still in use as vegetable gardens, and also the pastures in the uplands are still in use and grazed both by cows and by sheep. And it is quite interesting, this lack of abandonment. And it was something I investigated for many years, starting from the reconstruction, not focusing at the very beginning on the abandonment, by the reconstruction of a controversy around the access right to commons that involved the use of a river to make water aqueducts to bring water to the terrace, to the fields of three hamlets, Caroso, Carregli, and Perlezzi, on which I focused on. And I reconstructed the very first controversy and also its materialization, as we will see in the space through archaeological surveys. And then I started to reconstruct how, in which way there was this continuity of use of the water aqueduct and also of the pasture that is not documented in the neighboring valley, in the neighboring hamlet of the same valley. And I started my investigation in the field from the aqueduct, and I state that there was a contemporaneity between the construction of the aqueduct and of the terraces. And this allowed me to build a chronology of the process of colonization through archaeological terraces of the southern part of the territory of Perlezzi. And in this way, I understood that the controversy I have reconstructed that was part of a long one, it was a 50 years controversy, was related to the most important phase of terracing of the aqueduct of the territory of Perlezzi at the half of the 18th century. And it was related to the process of reduction of common lands, but it is important to highlight that even if the common lands, the extension of common lands was reduced, the villa of Perlezzi, the shared use of resources was not reduced due to the presence of the aqueduct, and so the need to share the water and to divide the water between the different access rights. And I could see, thanks to the very precise way to represent the controversy in the map I showed you at the very beginning, was the way through which the possession was claimed by the different local actors involved in the controversy. So it was testified by the use, as I said I said before, the use, so the presence of private plots inside common lands, by the use of pastures of the commons of the common lands as pastures, by the presence of abandoned seasonal settlement, and by the attribution of place name. There is a difference between the place name given by the people of Perlezzi and by the one of Caroso. So they say this plot that is Prati del Grazzarino for the people of Perlezzi was named Campo Murtizio from the people of Caroso. And we were able, due to the precision of the map and all its topographical reference, to identify this plot in the present landscape, and it is a wet meadow. And it is interesting to evidence that this is a hawthorn with a tree shape, a tree hawthorn, and it is an evidence of a possession of this wet meadow that is a private plot inside common land. Well, was a private plot inside common land. And the observation of the element that during this investigation, pushed me to start to see the evidence of the past uses, not only as evidence of uses, but also in terms of their meaning for the appropriation of the space. And so in terms of the temporality of the appropriation of the space, they justify if temporary or permanent, or if they were possession seen, so the evidence of a definitive appropriation, like isolated authors or maybe shilling and fences in some cases. And this jurisdictional perspective allowed me to understand from this approach a process quite well known in Southern Europe, that was the productivization of mountain areas due to the need to make them productive of woodland, because the idea was to make productive mountain areas, pushing forward the commercialization of their resources. And so there was a process of replacement of wooded pasture in coppice woodland that involved many places in Ligurian Apennines and not only. And the idea was to convert wooded pastures in woodland to promote the production of charcoal. And this is one of the evidence we document. And what is interesting is that in doing so, the access right to the use of common lands were transferred by local people to the forestry army that was, which was the one who decided if it was possible to make the ignition of a charcoal kiln or not, and to make the cut or not of the trees of the woodland. And this is this process was at the very beginning testified by the presence of pollarded trees that remained after the cutting, because this was another private plot inside common land. So it was not possible to cut this plot, and it remained as the evidence of the past uses, and through pollen analysis it was possible to reconstruct also the previous uses. But it is not so interesting. It is interesting, well, not for this conversation. It is interesting to highlight that this process of productivization of woodland was promoted, happened in the framework of various reforms, mainly of the introduction of the forestry regime, promoted by central state with the aim of rationalizing and improving the exploitation of resources, replacing the local customary uses also for fiscal purposes. And this aiming the need to have an individual as an owner of the property, and also one practices, then many practices, was well, married very well with the physiographic and the agronomic models and theories developed during the 18th century, and brought to some acquisition, that was considered some acquisition, that scientific knowledge was better than the local empirical one, then the individual property was better than the collective one, and the monocultural practices were better or the multiple one, and that if it were possible to live in mountains when practices were converted in productive ones, replacing irrational and unproductive customary ones. And it has a very influential development in the meaning that I think that from these theories and from this consideration of rural areas still depends some unconscious bias that have a high influence also in our interpretation of the past. And so the idea that agroforestry pastoral practices, and more in general any practice, are just a way to produce something and does not matter any environmental, social, or jurisdictional meaning, because the focus is only on the economic and productive dimension. That always existed a dichotomic division between permanently cultivated and uncultivated areas, and between tree covered and not tree covered areas. And the idea that peasant people, the folkloric idea that peasant people, that traditional societies lived thanks to agroforestry pastoral activities in homogeneous communities and not economically stratified and socially diversified. And the nature and man have two separated stories, and the history of the first is not useful to the human one. And it is possible to follow in the map how the interpretation of environmental resources management practices changes through time, from the evidence of possession and the meaning, the jurisdictional meaning of practices in the maps of the 16th and the 18th centuries, to a high standardization of their representation until the seemingly neutral interpretation of the reality, with the idea that it is the certification of a reality and not its interpretation, and with the complete disappearing of any social dimension. And it is possible to build a very general trend along these 3 centuries, connecting the evidence of past uses, the uses itself, how changed the access right and the demography, and to show how there are a correlation between the monocultural conversion and the population, and the continuous depopulation with the forestry regime and the naturalistic conservation that drove the naturalization policy. And this general trend seems to work very well at Ventarola in Ligurian Apennines, where we see that there is a close correlation with between the abandonment and the monocultural conversion. And we see also, thanks to archaeological investigation, that this monocultural conversion not depended just by the state reform, but depended mainly by the need to replace the loss of economic function of this hamlet that was a mule track point along the network of mule tracks in Ligurian Apennines. And it is possible to think that when the road network was changed by the Sardinia Kingdom at the half of the 19th century, in this period, the monocultural conversion was the tentative to replace the other economic function, but it did not work. But to understand how the local the changes took place, we have always to look at anomalies. And so I have to come back to Perlezzi with all his continuity of use that is making by conflictuality, solidarity, and what emerged by the observation of the various changes in the agreement is the priority of the social relationship that still and the continuity, even with many changes of the shared use of resources. And even if at the macroeconomic situation was the same, also the area of Perlezzi was affected by the changes in the network or in the road network and the loss of importance of this economic space. And so what I want to highlight is that these changes in the way to share resources, the changes in the way to share resources could be one of the key topics to understand the continuity of use, and maybe it could help to understand how it is changes, because now the very material relationship that was represented by the open channels are being replaced by water pipes and by taps. So some action that before need a transmission of a local knowledge, and also the very strong idea of the other who is waiting for the water represented by the sluice. Now it is not more so strong. And so what I am arguing is if there is a relationship with the present situation of abandonment and the mechanization of the management of the aqueduct. And this is the different, the how shared resources continue or not to be used was, and how did the changes took place, was what pushed me to look at another dimension of the practices that is not only if they are temporary appropriation or permanent or not, but if they mean also they are related to individual uses or to shared uses or to collective uses. And I'm trying to do it to understand the role of improvements in the disappearing of sharing practices and the knock-on effect of the changes in the life of the local communities, and so in the social relationship between people. And so to understand how the relationship between practices, their material expression, the institution and local social groups and individual changes. And I hope to give you an overview about what I mean about the jurisdictional approach to the local inner social dimension of the landscape. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm sure that there's questions being tapped into the chat already, but thank you for a fascinating lecture, and I suspect for making us all wish that we were up in the mountains at this particular juncture in time. It was very fascinating to me to get a more archaeological perspective on these issues. Do we have any, I don't want to jump in first if there are no open questions, no chat as yet. I'm sure that people are just digesting for a moment. So I'll just get the ball rolling with a couple of things, if I may. One is your talk made me think very much about Polanyi's work on the Great Transformation and the issues of scale that are implicit in your talk, because it appears that, you know, with that kind of shift from that very intensive local shared knowledge to more centralized institutional practices and more generalized scientific knowledge, that there has been some disembedding valley is an important part of the process. So that's one comment and question. And the other is a little bit more out of left field and to do with agency and ownership, because you've presented the landscape very much as an object of human ownership, which has been contested over time and which is maintained through the continuous use and investment of labor and clearance and knowledge and ritual and so forth. But it also strikes me that that's not the only agency in the equation, in that you've actually got all these transhuman animals that are acting as agents in terms of clearing the land. You've got the forests, which have their own volatility in producing secondary forests very quickly, I imagine, once the land has turned to scrub. So I was going to sort of ask you a kind of generalized question about the potential for thinking about non-human agency and for sort of de-anthropocentrizing the theory to some extent. And then while I'm still waiting for other questions to come in, I wonder if there was implicit in your talk is the notion that that investment of labor in the clearance of the forest, or the thinning of the forest and use of it, is intrinsic to the notion of commons. But it strikes me that in a contemporary European environment, that a forested commons might have a quite different set of uses for tourism and harvesting of other things. So some questions there for you, but if you want to put those aside, I'm very happy to jump to a question from Henry. I don't know if you can see the chat, but in case everyone can't, he's talking about abandonment. Do you consider it abandonment to have a legal effect, sort of the reverse of what you're suggesting, so that rather than finding ownership through the research, how effective is the abandonment? And in England and Wales, personal property is quite hard to abandon. Land would have to be still owned until some kind of other possession took place. So take your pick from that rather flurry of questions there.
Yes, of course, the no human, the idea of the history of an environment is the relationship between the history of each part of the environment, and that the man is a part of the environment, not outside. And there is a history of the relationship between the different stories. And so it is, yes, I completely agree with you in that sense. And about thank you for the question to Harry and to Eugene. And yes, I think that abandonment is interesting to address because it is the moment in which rights on a space are not more claimed. So had a legal effect in the sense that nobody claimed, and so it is a space where it is possible to build new rights in some way, because there are no people that claim their right there. It is quite interesting to see that in the archives, conflicts ends when areas are abandoned. But what happened before abandonment or conflict? The end of conflict or the starting of the abandonment? There is a close relationship between both are the erosion of the social relationship that were involved in the occupation of one space. And so I think that abandonment have a legal effect because nobody claimed that space. And in urban areas, many spaces that are no more used then are occupied by people for new uses. And so there is a relationship between these phenomena. And the second question?
Well, I'm going to jump to Chris Gerard's question because it's directly related to the last one, Anna. So he asks whether you observe different, I'll come back to Eugene's question in a sec, but do you observe differences between Italy and Spain in terms of the abandonment of common land, or does each valley have its own biography?
Both, in the sense that surely each valley has its own biography, but there is also a difference in the organization of the settlement and also in the institutional attention to maintain the use of mountain spaces that in the Basque Country is very, very high for mountains. And so there you can see how the institutional policies are exploited by local communities. So there are many differences because there is the local agency that is inside the community and the relationship between the local communities and with the institution. And this is also reflected in the process of abandonment. But it is not enough. We have also to address the local dimension. Surely in Italy, we have this process of naturalization that is harder than in other countries. And I hope we will overcome them. And yes, there is, to answer to Eugene, yes, surely the lack of trees is a problem, but when you have too much trees, there are many problems because above all, as I said, in the space where trees grow up in few years in spaces that were pastures or wooded pasture for centuries over millennia, so with very, very thin soils. And trees need bigger soils. And so when there are too much trees, some of them fell down, as I show in one picture, and it give origin to process of erosion. Then that increase the hydrogeological instability of the slopes, and this increase the environmental effect of the climatic change. Well, the rain, the more raining that we have in the same time. At the same, in the same way, too much trees, the mass of many dead wood, many dead trees in woodland, because nobody clean more woodland, make that fires are more dangerous because there are too much wood mass burn. And so this is the reason for which, as we saw in Portugal some years ago, there are these incredible wildfires that cannot stop because there is too much to burn. And there are no more than that open areas that were lived before, that clean areas that avoided that fire extend everywhere. I hope to. Yes. And this is the idea of trees is exactly the urban-centered perspective, because trees is felt something every time good, but as everything, it depends by the context. Somewhere trees are very good, but somewhere else they are not so good. Well, not too much. Trees are good, but not too much. And
okay, I'm going to roll a couple of questions together for you because we're running out of time a bit, Anna. And one is from Gilbert, which asks how much of the transfer of land ownership was done by legal means and how much by force. And then there's one from Michael asking whether land registers have a role to play in when they come into existence in various countries. So
land registers are a very interesting question, because also still today, land registers in Italy, cadastres, are not a legal way to testify the possession, because many times in cadastres, in land registers, it is not transcribed, the actual property. And it was also the same in the past. So if we study just the land registers without compare them with other kind of sources that in Italy are notary acts, we cannot have a truly idea of the changes in the possession. And it is quite interesting to see how commons were during the 19th century oh, I have not the word, were make no visible, giving them the strange name in the land registers by the parish, the prior of the parish and the mayor of the hamlet.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question. Can I ask you to be quick, because we kind of do need to, we're running over time a little, Anna, but Anastasia asks how an individual would go about claiming abandoned land, or indeed could one?
Well, the question is to make, I don't know how in general, but there are many cases that people occupy spaces that are no more used, and it is now, but it was also in the past. Then a legal question arose, because if you use a space that it is not the yours, of course, then there is somebody that maybe don't want it. But there are many legal questions. Also, the collection of the fruit from trees. Many times people collect fruits from trees in private properties because there are no fences. And this is a way to appropriate of something that is of somebody else.
Lots of practice in that. I'm sure there'll be more questions coming, Anna, but
yes, I know that.
I think we need to draw things to a close there. Laszlo, I can see you've got a question about use and different uses of the same land, but I think you need to pin Anna down over tea one day and ask her that one, because we are running, I think, 10 minutes over time. So it just remains for me to thank you, Anna, for a wonderful lecture. I think you've given us all a lot of things to think about there and really opened up the notion of how commons are held in time and space, and historically as well. So many thank yous for that. I hope that you all enjoyed the lecture and that you will attend all of the fellows' lectures and seminars if you can, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you, and thank you